that noise, the volume, the ringing in your ears, I knew that I'd just dismasted and I was 1,000 miles from land in the Southern Ocean and completely on my own.
The Southern Ocean is the most hostile stretch of water on the planet. No land to break the swell, relentless storms, waves the height of a house. And that is where Lisa Blair found herself, demasted and alone. She attempted to become the fastest person ever to sail solo, non-stop and unassisted around Antarctica. I'm Hugh Taylor, and you're listening to The Art of Adventure, a podcast brought to you by Arthur Beale, outfitters to sailors, adventurers, vagabonds and explorers for over 500 years. In this episode, Lisa shares her incredible story, telling us not just what motivates her to attempt new feats and break world records, but also how she kept going when everything around her was going wrong. Today we're asking, do records only really count when you have something bigger to prove? Lisa, welcome to The Art of Adventure.
Thanks so much for having me on the show, Hugh.
One of the things we talk about in this podcast is whether people are born an adventurer or they become an adventurer. And you sort of got into sailing a little bit later on in life. So were you born an adventurer or did you just become one?
I think my family would debate this with you, but I feel like I became one. But my family would probably be like, no, you were a little terror running through the bush as a kid and you were definitely born an adventurer. So take your pick. But yeah, I feel like definitely coming to sailing late and just embracing the sport and the adventure in the sport of sailing was really what drove me to it.
Tell us how you did get into sailing, because you did a little bit during your sort of childhood, teenage years, but it wasn't till your 20s that you sort of got the conversion and just became sort of sailing mad.
Absolutely. So, yeah, Mum actually got into sailing first. And when my parents divorced, she joined the local sailing club and her next partner happened to have a sailing boat, which was all big and fancy. But I was also a teenage girl who wasn't at all slightly interested. And so we would go on the occasional holiday and the occasional sailing trip. And it was always fun, but it wasn't this thing that hooked me. And then when I was in my final year of uni, I managed to get a random job as the hostess on a sailing boat. And I just thought it sounded like a cool thing to do for a summer job. And it'd fill in a few months while I waited for the last year of uni to complete. And I absolutely just fell in love with it. I think I was old enough by then to understand that sailing was so much more than just pulling up the white flappy stuff and pointing the boat in one direction. There was all this sort of trigonometry and this problem solving and it really could be something that you could challenge yourself with. And yeah, I just fell in love with it.
Tell us how you sort of progressed to your first adventure from there.
Yeah, so I worked my way out of the galley into another role, which was like deck/host. And then I had an opportunity to sail with some friends from Samoa to Hawaii. So it was like 3 months of ocean sailing, first time entering a watch system, first time I really had the opportunity to helm, sail through a storm, not see land at all. And it was just the most extraordinary experience. And I can still remember standing watch one night solo and just having whales swimming past and you couldn't see them, but you could hear them just breathing gently in the moonlight beside the boat as we sailed. And I just fell in love with that idea of freedom in the middle of the ocean. And I came back from that trip and I found out about this amateur yacht race called the Clipper Round the World Yacht Race, which hopefully most of England knows very well. It's Robert Knox Johnson's brainchild. So I saw this race and I thought, this looks amazing and I want to do it, but I had no money. So I started campaigning and doing my first sponsorship profile and I went to the local library and borrowed a book on sports marketing and had to figure out what it was that I could offer a sponsor and kind of learn about that industry. And ultimately, I got the chance to race around the planet over 12 months with a crew of 16 people, and it was life-changing. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, and I still think it's one of the hardest things, aside from nearly dying in the Southern Ocean, but we'll get to that, no doubt.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible in itself. What happened after that then? What was the next stage in your sailing life?
I was running these corporate hospitality charters and backpacker charters around the Whitsunday Islands in this like beautiful tropical climate. I sort of tried to figure out how I could progress my sailing and try and become more with it than what I'd already achieved. And I always felt like one of the best ways to test myself was to do solo sailing, because I'd read all the books and I'm absolutely fascinated with it. So I decided that I would sign up for the Trans-Tasman Yacht Race, which is New Zealand to Australia, and it runs once every 4 years. And I didn't own a boat. I didn't know how to solo sail. I'd never solo sailed before, and I had 12 months to kind of figure it out. So that was my first soft launch into solo sailing, and I had to convince a complete stranger to lend me their boat to sail to New Zealand and back. And I didn't know anyone that owned a boat that would actually lend me their boat. So we put an article in the, on mysailing.com, which is an online sailing forum. And the editor of the article actually ended up lending me his boat to race to New Zealand and back.
Fantastic. And how did you get on in the race?
Pretty disastrous getting there, I have to say. The first time I hoisted the sails on the boat was when I set off from Barrenjoey Heads in Sydney, Australia. And I figured I had 1,200 nautical miles to figure it out. And it didn't really matter how long it took me to get there, as long as I got there before the race start date. And the race committee required you to have 48 hours in port before you turn around and race back to Australia. So as long as I was there before that date, things were good. But along the way, the AIS wasn't working. The autopilot kept tripping out. The amount of pirouettes I've done in the middle of the Tasman Sea on this boat was incredible. So I spent most of the trip with a little mechanical oven timer setting 20-minute alerts, and I would curl up on the floor of the cockpit right by the helm there so that I could catch it when the wheel wigged out and the autopilot failed. And I just limped my way across the Tasman Sea and found my first big storm solo, deployed the first drogue in a storm system, nearly got rolled by this massive wave. So yeah, it was quite an adventure. And then the race coming back, we had water spouts, we had just incredibly squally conditions. I managed to finish 8th, I think, out of 20 odd boats, which I felt was pretty good for my first attempt, and just had an amazing adventure out there. And I came back with the knowledge that I was capable of doing a lot more.
So you finished the Solo Tasman Challenge. What next? Time for a breather?
I had already planned the next challenge before I started the Solo Trans-Tasman, and it really came about because I was trying to convince a complete stranger to lend me his boat, and he had this beautiful Class 40 Arnsey girl up for sale. It's James Buick. He's an incredible sailor. And I had called him and I said, hey, I really want to race your yacht in the Trans-Tasman. It's up for sale. Would you consider leasing it to me? And he, at the time, was just like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm a smart person. I'm not going to let you go and break my boat right before I'm trying to sell it. Very wise. But he did give me the idea. And he basically in that conversation said, look, maybe if you combine this project with a larger project, you would have the capacity to raise more sponsorship and actually buy the boat. And then you can use this boat for both projects and run a big campaign. And I was like, oh, yeah, but I don't have a larger project in mind. What are you thinking? And he was the first one to throw out this idea of challenging Fedor Konyakov's record and going and sailing solo around Antarctica. And he was originally looking at it himself, but then his wife got pregnant and raising a family. He didn't want to, pursue that path anymore. So he's like, look, the boat's capable. Go and have a look at this guy, Fedor Konyakov, see what he did and see what you think. And I originally Googled Fedor, and he's the most remarkable adventurer out of Russia. And what he's done for adventure is incredible. And I looked at this project, and he spent 102 days sailing solo around Antarctica nonstop in the roaring 40s, furious 50s, screaming 60s, snow, ice, icebergs, everything thrown at him. And then this complete stranger that doesn't even know that I haven't even sailed solo yet is going, yeah, you can do this. And I'm like, no, this is a bad call. And so I originally wasn't going to do anything else afterwards. But I originally didn't think I was capable of doing the record around Antarctica with the sailing experience that I currently had. And I didn't really know how to bridge that gap at the time. And I hadn't sailed solo when the idea was first kind of proposed to me. And so I thanked him very much, went on my merry way, ended up borrowing this other vessel, and I couldn't shake the idea of it's sort of that question, like, what if? What would the conditions be like? How cold is cold? Where is the iceberg line? What type of boat would I need to be able to succeed in a project like that? And I was working in the tropics in the Whitsundays, beautiful, like on the coral reef, sailing around beautiful islands, warm temperature. And I was just constantly thinking of my trip with the Clipper race around the Southern Ocean and the big seas that we saw and the incredible seascapes that you get out there in the vast Southern Ocean and, these enormous waves. And I just reflected on that whole experience from the position of a solo sailor rather than with crew. And I just continued to think to myself, well, could I do it? And what would I need? And then I started looking into what is the worst case scenario that I, weather-wise that I would encounter and what type of boat I feel would go through that. And so by the time I came back from the Trans-Tasman, this idea had kind of fully cemented in my mind, but I'd already sort of started softly floating it past my family and just been like, hey, there's this concept of me sailing solo around Antarctica. What do you think about that? And my family were pretty adamant no, pretty hard no. They're like, no, we've supported you around with crew. You're not doing that. And then I did the Trans-Tasman and I had sailed 3,000 miles solo and I had overcome all these other challenges on that boat and I'd succeeded and I at least knew what I was up for now. And so ultimately they begrudgingly gave me their blessing and I started campaigning with the goal of trying to become the first woman and the fastest person to go solo nonstop and unassisted around Antarctica. And that was 2014.
And obviously there was quite an issue, not surprisingly, in terms of raising the money to buy the boat. And I think your parents ended up mortgaging their house to help you. But you got it together, you got the boat, you set off on the challenge hoping to break 2 records, one the fastest time around and secondly the first woman to go around. What happened on that journey?
Ooh, plenty. Yeah, so it took me 3.5 years to reach the start line. So it was I still feel like the biggest challenge was getting to the start line out of everything, except for maybe this one whoopsie that happened. So I set off and it's immediately, the minute you start heading south, it gets colder and colder and colder. And we're sailing through the roaring 40s, furious 50s, screaming 60s. So it's effectively you can't go outside of those barriers for this record. So I'm challenging Fedor Konyakov's record. So I have to start and finish from the same location as him. And I would have to adhere to the same kind of rules that he established, which meant that while these huge storms are wrapping around the Southern Ocean, you can't go north of them and you can't go south of them. So you're going right through the center of the conditions. So on an average, sort of once a week, you would go through a cyclonic size Southern Ocean storm generating 10 to 12 meter waves, sort of 70 to 80 knots of wind, and it's freezing wind, it's freezing sea temperature, and you've just got to grit your teeth and get through it. So we had sailed with difficulty through the South Pacific Ocean, rounded Cape Horn. I had this epic storm at Cape Horn, which I dubbed the mother of all storms, and just snuck around under Drogue. And then I thought that the biggest hurdle was kind of behind me. And then I started sort of thinking, all right, I've hit the halfway mark. We're getting there. And the South Atlantic was very brutal. So the storms were a lot more frequent, heaps of squalls, but the squalls would dump hail and snow, and they would generate sort of 50 to 60 knots of wind through a small localized squall, but you'd have to run up on deck in those conditions and change the sails. And so you're bolting up on deck, getting pelted by icy cold snow. It was the most painful experience. And then you have to go back inside and basically treat yourself for hypothermia because I would be my core temperature would drop so rapidly every sail change. And so the physical fatigue was quite extreme for that whole leg of the journey. I also had about 2 weeks of intense fog. I didn't see the sky for that whole time, and I couldn't see more than sort of 50 meters from the boat all around. So there was really thick, persistent fog. And then I sailed out of the South Atlantic and I was just starting to enter the South Indian Ocean when everything went terribly wrong. So I was on deck for sunset, did the sail changes and did the deck checks, and I'm looking for everything to make sure it's safe and it's good. And then I went below to try and get a little bit of a sleep, knowing that I had a new storm coming through that night. And it wasn't going to be like the be all and end all, but it was going to be worse than what the conditions currently were. And at about 20 minutes later, I just had this bang, and it was like the most brutal metallic kind of volume behind it. And it was just like deafeningly loud inside the cabin of the boat. And I knew something critical had broken, but I'd never experienced this situation before. I'd planned for it, but I hadn't experienced it before. So I didn't really know how to respond correctly. So my instant response was, what broke? And so I jumped up onto my engine box, and I have this little perspex dome that allows me to look out without actually climbing out of the boat. And so I initially thought it was my running backstays had broken at the back of the vessel, and they were fine. And I looked at the front, and I could just see my 22-meter long mast, aluminium mast, just bending and flexing like meters of flex. And I'm just thinking to myself, this is so not good. My gut reaction was tack the boat. So I was trying to get my life jacket on, and I was just clipping to the hatch to climb out when I heard it come crashing down. And I can tell you that noise, the volume, the ringing in your ears afterwards, the knowledge that that one moment in time, that one critical thing of failure has just taken years of your goals, years of your effort and your focus from you in just like split second. And I knew that I'd just dismasted. And I was 1,000 miles from land in the Southern Ocean and completely on my own.
And it's worth pointing out, getting demasted is incredibly dangerous because obviously the mast is normally still connected to the boat in some way through the rigging, and it could be dragging in the sea.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for me, it was at risk of puncturing the hull and sinking the boat. And if it did that, if I lost the boat, I wouldn't have come home.
So how did you address that issue? Because you've basically got to, in effect, cut it free, which is much easier said than done.
Yes, it is. And like a lot of our preparation and planning that we're sort of told by experts to take for these trips is, bolt cutters, angle grinder, some form of cutting implement. And I had tested the bolt cutters on that gauge rigging wire. It was 14 mil hammer rigging wire. I tested it before I left, and it was fine on the dock on a flat surface with my whole body weight on it. But when the boat's pitching and rolling in incredible seas, I was in about 8-meter seas and 45 knots of wind when the mast snapped. And so I was also effectively, the mast and everything fell on the starboard side. It tore all the safety rails off. It broke at deck level. So I have a massive spear attached to the boat with all the rigging wire and everything. And I've got these 8-meter waves that are breaking, hitting the debris in the water first and sort of shoving it really aggressively on the deck forward to the point where it was like kind of breaking and snapping all my halyards. So every time a wave came through, it would bury the boat completely. So I was up to my neck in white water, and I was technically anchored in the center of this huge storm in the Southern Ocean by the debris in the water. So I panicked for the first 15 minutes and just had that knee-jerk reaction of like, I've got to cut it free. I've got to cut it free. And I ran for my bolt cutters. I'm tethered, I'm crawling around the deck of the boat, every wave that hits throwing me to the low side of the boat, like I'm just getting dragged across the boat, trying not to lose the bolt cutters, trying to get them in position. The boat's pitching every time you're trying to jump on them to cut a piece of rigging. And I spent about 15 minutes, 20 minutes in full freak out mode. And at that point, I realized what I was attempting to do wasn't working, and I needed more tools. And I had this hot pink pencil case, which had a needle nose pliers, a flathead screwdriver, some vice grips, and a hammer. And basically, my intention was to disconnect the rigging from the boat rather than trying to cut it. And so I spent like another 10 minutes smashing that, trying to disconnect and knock a split pin out. But it was under so much pressure, I couldn't get it loose. And I was shaking so hard by this point that I was just smashing my hand instead of the screwdriver. And it was just a mess. And it was at this point that I thought I should probably tell somebody. that I'm going through this, because nobody on land knew what I was going through or that something bad had happened. And it was about 2 a.m. in Australia, local time. So I called my shore manager up and I notified him that I had dismasted. And I just remember him being so empathetic and just being like, oh no. But he has no idea I'm in 8 meters and that the mast is ripping a hole through the deck of the boat, and the noise and the chaos of that moment, he can't see that. And I just remember saying to him, I've got no time. I'm issuing a pan, and I hung up.
So it's just worth saying pan is sort of at the level below a mayday call.
Absolutely. That was the next thing I was going to say. Yeah, because for me, like most people think, why didn't you issue a mayday? Because you're, in a potentially sinking boat and you're so far from land. But help was never going to get there in time to actually save me. So the pan's a way of putting everyone on alert, and it's I require assistance, but it's not an I require an immediate assistance.
I mean, it's all very well doing a pan, but if you weren't able to cut the sort of rigging loose, you were going to die. I mean, the boat was not going to survive, was it?
And that's the reality. So why send someone down to rescue me?
Yeah.
If I'm not coming back, it would be a recovery mission, and I'd be putting other people at risk to recover a body that might not be there. So yeah, I had already known when I left port for this record that I was outside of rescue range for majority of the trip, and that rescue was ultimately not really an option for most scenarios. Even abandoning to a life raft in those conditions, like my 50-foot, 10-ton boat is getting picked up and tossed around like it weighs nothing. An inflated, tubed life raft's not going to keep me alive in those conditions for 3 days when I was already showing signs of hypothermia. Like there was just so many other factors to that. But unbeknown to me, the Rescue Coordination Centre upgraded it to a mayday and diverted a ship. I'll get to that in a minute, but it took me another sort of 3 to 4 hours to slowly make my way around the boat, disconnecting piece by piece. And at one point, I actually had to climb outside the safety rails onto the bowsprit of the boat and approach the forestay wire from there because of the way the mast had broken and the way it had fallen, which basically means I'm hanging on to a stick out the bow of the boat in 8-meter breaking seas. So that was probably the hardest part of the whole experience, because the chance of coming back from that was pretty low. But I knew at this point I had a hole the size of a large kind of dinner plate, I guess, in the side of the boat, and the mast was rapidly starting to cut through now that it had gotten past like the deck hull joint of the boat. And I knew the boat was going to sink if I didn't go out there. So that was a calculated risk, but it was a significant risk. And at about 2 a.m, I finally managed to disconnect the last pieces of the rigging wire. I was pretty significantly hypothermic by that point, and I'd put a retrieval line on it because I thought I could use the debris the next day or once the conditions calmed, and, maybe build a new mast or at least get the sails and the satellite dishes and things like that off it. But it's an aluminium mast, so it sinks. And as it sinks, the boat is moving up over 8-meter waves. And so it's effectively dragging that huge pile of debris and rigging and sail and everything, trying to pull it up through those waves. And within like 2 wavelengths, the rope snapped. And I lost everything to the Southern Ocean, but I survived.
Yeah, which is the important bit. And so obviously your
Exactly.
pan had been upgraded to a mayday. So you're there in the middle of the ocean with no mast and no sail. What happened next?
So the boat hull was intact-ish enough, I felt, to get me to land. I was unaware still that the mayday was occurring. I didn't learn about that until about 5 o'clock the next day. So I spent the rest of that night self-treating for hypothermia and trying to re-warm myself at a gradual rate so I didn't do damage. And then by sunrise, I finally was able to make contact with my shore team and my family. And part of the protocols we set up is in an emergency situation, I don't communicate with my family at all. I don't directly talk to them. I don't call them. No communication because it's too emotional and too volatile. Whereas I talk directly with my shore manager and my shore manager relays that information. So he had relayed it so effectively that my mum went to work the next day thinking I was totally fine and not at all realizing how the severity of it. It wasn't until she read my blog the next day that she called me breaking down in tears going, oh my God, I had no idea. So I spent the day clearing the debris from the water. I had to make a choice on the record because with these sorts of boats, we could potentially build a jury rig and use debris around the boat to build a new mast and finish the record. I would be able to have set the women's record. I just wouldn't have been eligible for the speed record anymore. And so that was an option. And I repaired the hull, or I did a patch on the hull on the side of the boat using a dry bag and sealed all of that up so that was mostly watertight again. And I got all the water out of the boat. It was a full day trying to just recover from the debris. I ran a new safety line, all of that. So by the time the sat phone called and the rescue coordination center rang me and they were like, do you still require the aid of this ship? And I'm like, what ship? I didn't call for a ship. I knew the ship was never going to get here. So they updated me at that point that they converted it to a Mayday, and the closest vessel to me was this bulk carrier, Far Eastern Mercury, and they were 600 nautical miles directly north. But they had been trying to head south and the sea state was so bad for them that they had to slow the ship down to sort of 6 knots. All the crew were seasick and they were having an atrocious time trying to reach me. So I spoke to the guy and I said, look, I feel like I can get myself to Cape Town. I had about 230 litres of fuel remaining on board the boat. And I managed to get the engine working after about an hour or two of troubleshooting it. So I had made the decision to start motoring north towards Cape Town, which was the only safe decision you could kind of make in that scenario. And I asked if there's any chance that they could talk to the master of the ship instead of trying to do a rescue, whether they could do a fuel transfer at sea and actually rendezvous with me and give me some fuel. He came back and said, yep, we're in, we'll do it. And so I continued motoring north and they continued motoring south. And it took us another 3 days to intercept each other because of how remote I was. Ultimately, that became not such a great decision. The intention was really positive and they genuinely came down to help. But through communication issues, I didn't speak Korean, they didn't speak English. It became a really dangerous situation quite quickly. And this is a 200-meter long vessel. They weigh 86,000 tons. The side of the ship is 30 meters high, and I am 15 meters. The side of my ship is 1.2 meters, and I weigh 10 tons. So completely different scales. And we're still in 6-meter swell, 25 knots of wind. It's still pretty bad conditions. And so I accepted this one rope thinking that I'd be able to hold off at the back of the ship and they could pass me the dairy cans down one at a time or the containers of fuel that they had. Unbeknown to me, they thought I still wanted to tie up where they had put fenders out. And their fenders were 2 car tires hanging off the side of the ship at water level. But because the ship's in 6-meter swell, these fenders were 1 minute touching the surface of the ocean and the next minute were 10 meters up in the air and then touching the surface of the ocean again. So they're rolling really hard. And I knew if I had have accepted a bow and a stern line from them, that they would lift me completely out of the water. And because of where the structural damage was on the middle of the boat from the mast, I had every possibility that the boat would snap in half and sink. So I got this one line on. They started walking me up the side of the boat. I'm holding myself off the side of the ship with the engine. And I get in this awkward situation where I can't motor away because we've got this line holding me, but I also can't get enough steerage to hold myself directly off the ship. And they're drifting towards me at a rate of about 5 knots. And I'd been kind of reversing off the ship at the same rate, trying to keep myself safe. And very, very quickly, we collided with each other and I got pinned under the side of this ship. And it was so extreme. Every impact had so much force that the whole hull of my boat was flexing the wrong direction. So significant damage was taking place. I ditched their lines, ran to the back of my throttle, and I went full throttle in reverse, and I'm sort of bumping my way down the side of this ship. And there's this incredible moment where the back corner of the vessel, of the ship, lifted out of the water on a wave at just sort of the right angle that almost the whole propeller came out of the water. And it created a vacuum of all the water filling what it previously had displaced. And it basically sucked my whole boat under the ship. And I very clearly can remember looking up at the back of the ship hanging above me in the air and watching the water drip from the ship onto the bow of my boat. Like I was under the ship. And I'm still in reverse. And I immediately am like, where's my life raft? Where's my grab bag? Where's my bilge pumps? And I'm thinking of like, how am I going to deal with this when they land on the first part of my boat and break the boat in half? And I don't know how, but we just got clear. And as the ship landed back in the water, we had maybe 3 or 4 centimeters, and that was it, like millimeters of space. And we got clear, but it still took me like another 6 hours to try and convince them to put the fuel in containers, put the containers in the water, and then I can collect it from the water. And at this point, I now had a 3-meter long crack against the hull of the boat as well. And just, it ended up being more damage by the ship, unfortunately, than it was by the actual dismasting originally, which is incredible. And I did continue to communicate with the master, and he was incredibly generous with his time to come down and divert from their course. And there's zero ill feelings. It was just a bad situation of circumstance and poor communication. But I was able to get some fuel in the end. And then I worked out the fuel was black, and I didn't know if it was crude oil or some other type of fuel. And so I ended up building a new mast with the boom, and that took me another sort of 3 or 4 days, and then motor sailed the rest of the way to Cape Town. And it took me 10 days after the original dismasting to reach land.
So you got to Cape Town, and Lisa being Lisa, it's not a question of giving up and heading back to Australia. What did you do next?
I arrived pretty broken, and I was just so upset that the project was over. And it wasn't until somebody suggested to me that I could restart the record that I started to feel like I had kind of oomph again and grit and like, you know, wanting to get into it. So we landed, I say we a lot, also it's me in the boat. So we landed in Cape Town, and within a week we had the mast. We were trying to find a new mast, and we were trying to repair the hull. The boat was lifted out of the water, and this lovely family in South Africa adopted me and let me stay in their spare room for like 2 months while I was repairing the damage to the boat. I arrived with absolutely nothing. And I think this is a true testament to the adventure community within sailing and other sports as well, because I arrived and a whole group of complete strangers adopted me into their community instantly because they could see I was trying, and they could see, and they wanted to support the adventure. And I think that's a really beautiful part of our world of adventure, is it is a real community. And so it took us a long time to even find a mast, and we found a secondhand mast in Cape Town that happened to fit my boat that had been sitting in a shed for like 15 years. And we whacked that in the boat, and I did a 3-hour test sail with it, which is not enough. And I made the decision that if I left and anything felt wrong, I would turn around and come back. But I was very aware that we were now going into the beginning weeks of winter, and I would be sailing across the Southern Ocean in winter. And so when I announced I was leaving, I was really unprepared for the public response to that. I got thousands and thousands of messages of hate, effectively. People saying, don't go, you're not capable, you're just a girl, who do you think you are? We're going to have to just rescue you. Somebody got a hold of my mum's private phone number and would call her and say, if you let your daughter leave, she's not coming home. And not one of those people actually had a genuine reason for saying this. I emailed and I'd communicate back and say, show me the historical weather that tells me it's impossible. Show me the data that tells you that you can't sail through those conditions. And nobody had anything of actual substance behind it. It was this opinion that because nobody had ever sailed the Southern Ocean solo in winter before, it therefore mustn't be possible. So I very kindly thanked them for their thoughts and then left anyway. And when I set sail, the center of the storms in summer would generate sort of 10 to 12 meter seas, 70 to 80 knots of wind. The temperatures were generally at 0 or just above 0, but it was still manageable, right? Sort of. The center of the storms in winter would generate 15 to 20 meter waves, and you've got blistering cold conditions. So you've got the risk of ice building up in the rigging. You've got a lot more snow dumping on the boat. You've got a lot of additional challenges, but the scale of those waves changing was the biggest shift. And you also, instead of having a storm once a week, you would be getting one every other day. So there were, the abundance of storms was just so many more. And so I was trying to go north-south to get back to where I dismasted and cross my track again before continuing back to Australia. And that section, trying to sail from Cape Town directly south, the storms are going from west to east around the bottom of the planet. And I had the option of sailing through 15 to 20 meter waves, which I didn't think was very survivable, or try and get a gap to get across. And at the same time, I got a massive head cold. I got full body fevers. I had a few glitchy things with the new mast, like chafing on halyards and ropes and stuff that previously I hadn't had. And I also had this overwhelming public pressure to say that I'm not capable. And so it was this combination of events. And I was sort of 200 miles off the bottom of Cape Town getting my ass handed to me after wave, like the boat in the center of a storm, we'd be getting flipped upside down nearly 20 times. You're dealing with heavy snow, fog, sleet, freezing conditions. It's as wet inside the boat as it is outside, and it's just terrifying and uncomfortable. And I had been hove to in the storm, and a halyard came free, and it wrapped around a piece of rigging, and I had to go out on the deck to untangle it and reattach it to the base of the mast. And as I was doing that, I was between storms, but we still had large, messy seas, and I had my back to the waves, which is a big no-no. And I didn't see the wave. I just heard it break basically on top of us, this huge green wave. And it just destroyed the boat. It just tore across the deck, dragged me with it, and just ripped me over the rails. And I thought I was a goner.
But you had a line onto the boat.
I was tethered,
yeah,
absolutely. But I didn't think the tether would have held in those conditions. But I managed to hook my elbow around the piece of rigging as I swept past. So my legs, waist, hips, everything's overboard, and I've got one arm and half a shoulder kind of still in the boat. And the boat's on its side, completely underwater. And somehow as the boat kind of came up, I was able to sort of roll backwards into the boat and flop back on the deck. And I was shaking so hard from that, and just the adrenaline and the fear and the overwhelmingness of all these people saying I can't do it. And I crawled back to the cockpit and I called Mum, and I just said, I quit. I can't do it. I'm going back. It's too dangerous. It's too risky. I promised myself if anything didn't feel right, I'd go back. Like, it doesn't feel right. I'm going back. And I was hove to in the storm. I couldn't go anywhere yet. I had to wait for the break in the storm before I could start sailing again. And so Mum gave me some very sound advice, and she has been an incredible supporter. And I think people underrate the support network structure of adventure. You can't endure these situations completely on your own. Like, you might be the one on the boat, but you've got this community around you. And obviously my mum's a huge part of that. And her advice to me at the time was really, I want you to imagine that you're 72 days into your world record. You never dismasted. You never stopped at Cape Town. You're feeling like this and experiencing these conditions. Would that have been enough to make you quit? Or is it because you've just come from Cape Town, 5 days ago, that you're feeling like this, and that there's this pressure that you can't do it? And I marinated on that overnight, and I realized that actually, she's right. I wouldn't have quit. I would have done absolutely everything possible to keep going. And so I decided that I would just start hoving to through the center of the storms, and I would sail for a little bit, hove to for a little bit, sail for a little bit, hove to for a little bit. And for the listeners who aren't sure what hove to is when you stall the sails and drift the boat sideways in a storm to create like a barrier of protection from the waves. And it's a way we get through these really large storms. And ultimately, I was able to spend the last 6 weeks sailing back to Australia and became the first woman with one stop after being away from Australia for 183 days, because they count the time in South Africa as well. But yeah, that was a real defining moment where it could have been enough's enough, but I would have been hanging up my hat on adventure forever, not just that project. And I made the choice that I had it in me and I would give it a red hot crack and I would carry on.
Which was incredible to complete that. But obviously, although you got a record, you hadn't quite got the record that you really wanted.
Absolutely.
So in 2022, you tried again, and this time with, I know there were trials and tribulations, but compared to the first adventure, it was relatively smooth, wasn't it? And you got the record.
I think surprisingly the conditions were worse in the second record. Overall, I was often in bigger seas more frequently. The boat was flipped upside down 3 times in 15-meter breaking seas. Like, it was pretty atrocious as well. But I didn't dismast, so I was able to complete the record. And yeah, I broke it by 10 days, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah, and that record still stands to this day, which is an incredible
Yes.
achievement. And you almost seem a little bit blasé about it. How did you reflect on it and take stock? And how did you sort of really understand and comprehend what you had achieved?
Great question. I think I'm still trying to comprehend. It's one of these things, you go from this incredibly isolated bubble to this intense arrival where you've got all your family, but you've got all this media coverage and all this sort of pulled 100 different directions, and everyone wants to hear the story, which is incredible because you want to share it, but it's also like intense, right? And I know for the 2022 record, that took me 8 years to achieve that. And so that's like, it wasn't an overnight project. It's 8 years of building myself up, building my experience, getting stronger, getting the right supporters. And it's this monumental thing. But I still don't feel like I catch myself sometimes just being like, oh yeah, I did do that. Yeah, that was me. And I forget. I guess I take the attitude that anyone can do what I do if they want to. If they really want to put the work in and spend the time, they have the capacity to upskill, to learn, to go and have these adventures. And so I don't necessarily see what I've done as different from an ultra trail runner who's doing a 250-mile race, or someone who's rowing across the Atlantic and doing the Atlantic Rowing Challenge, or any of these other incredible adventures out there. I guess I'm obviously like incredibly grateful that I've had this opportunity to have these adventures, because I think that that's the moments you get in the middle of the ocean in that level of extreme isolation with wildlife encounters and time with yourself and time with the boat. And it's time we don't get on land. And it's one of the beautiful things about crossing oceans and doing these long form kind of records. And when I come to land, I feel like I'm putting really tight shoes on, and then I go back to sea and it's like I'm coming home. And so I've learned, I guess, to celebrate the small wins along the journey rather than focusing so much on the main goal of the journey. And so a record is awesome. It's amazing to have a record, or to have 8 of them that I now have. But the goal for me is really, how can I create positive change? And that's what brings me so much joy. And so it's when the 12-year-old girl comes up to me and tells me that she put a Post-it note on the hull of the boat and has followed my adventures and used my story as a school project, like, that's the moments where I'm like, oh yeah, this is wild. Like, I think those are the moments that shape why I want to do it more and why I continue to do adventures over chasing records or goals. Like, they're necessary because they help me get funding and they help me, run the project and pull it all together. But ultimately it's around, how can we create a positive difference in our world? And that's what I'm all about. So that's what I choose to focus on.
And that actually really comes across in what you've planned next. Tell us about what you've planned in the Arctic.
Well, I actually came up with the idea of sailing around the Arctic when I was doing those last 6 weeks of the first record. And I knew I needed to build my profile, build my experience to really round out that vision. And a big part of my campaigns is the science and the storytell and the climate action part of my projects. And I knew the Arctic is hugely impacted by things like climate change. And I really wanted to be able to sort of use the story of adventure to showcase that environment and to raise awareness, but also genuine science research as well. So yeah, I've been slowly, quietly marinating on it for the last sort of 7 or 8 years, reading books, developing, researching, looking at historical weather data, the ice formations. And now I'm in a position where I can actually build the boat and start working towards leaving for the Arctic record. So the goal will be to go London to London, non-stop solo and unassisted around the Arctic Circle. Currently is yet to be achieved by anybody. There's been a couple of attempts recently with another British sailor, Ella, in the Arctic, and there's another sailor heading off this year who's attempting it but plans to use their motor through the light winds. So yeah, I'm hoping to be able to achieve that 2028 at the moment is what we're aiming for.
And the sad irony is that it's only really possible to sail or potentially sail around the Arctic because of climate change, isn't it? I mean, 100 years ago, it would not have been possible.
Absolutely. It wouldn't have been possible even 10, 15 years ago, not solo, not unassisted, not without using propulsion of an engine. It's only possible because the Arctic is melting or warming 4 times faster than anywhere else on the planet. And it's at a crossroads and a tipping point with the ice coverage. And for me, that just needs to be screamed from the rooftops. But I don't like promoting all the bad without following it up with a genuine positive solution for people. So a huge part of my project is on science research, is on solution finding. How can we save this world and what can we do collectively across the sport of sailing, but also as individuals within our own household to take more responsibility for our actions.
Yeah, and hopefully your 2028 adventure will have a huge amount of publicity and coverage, because obviously the science that you're doing is very important, but also highlighting, the real issues in this planet. It's important everybody understands exactly what it is, and you'll be able to sort of showcase it firsthand.
Absolutely. And, there's a lot of untold stories, like even with the sport of sailing, like fiberglass pollution, for example, is a significant issue for our oceans, and it's relatively untested at this stage. And so one of the big things about this project, which is so exciting, is I'm able to fund with researchers a huge project to look at circular economy in the marine space. And we're looking to build my boat out of basalt fiber and bioresins and create a fully recyclable circular marine vessel. And then we're open sourcing all that research globally, because we want to make sure that our communities aren't impacting the oceans as well. So yeah, it's going to be an incredible journey to watch.
Yeah, well, we look forward to hearing all about it in 2028. Thank you very much for joining us today and taking us through your incredible and fascinating life, and what an adventurer you are.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. It was a fantastic chat.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to Lisa for joining us. Her incredible book, Facing Fear, is available now, and you can follow her on social media to keep up with her amazing preparations for the Arctic. If you enjoyed this one, we have a great episode with Don McIntyre on the Golden Globe race. Another story about what happens when you strip everything away and leave one person alone with the sea. Coming up in the next episode, the incredible story of a former US president attempting to chart an unmapped river deep in the Amazon with deadly consequences.
Roosevelt's health really deteriorates quite rapidly, and he brings along for the trip a lethal dose of morphine in case he needed it. And he asks his son to administer that morphine.
The Art of Adventure is brought to you by Arthur Beale. That's beale.co.uk. Outfitters to sailors, adventurers, vagabonds and explorers for over 500 years. And in this series, our listeners get 15% off at arthurbeale.co.uk with the code podcast. This show was hosted by me, Hugh Taylor, produced by M. Wally, and the theme music is by Nasson De Silva.